Project Red was an IM that was teased last year on Crinacle's measurement database. Being a new collab, many were curious about what this would end up being. Now, Crinacle is quite well known, and its collaborations are generally well liked, although there have been a few that I myself didn't quite like. But many were still curious about what this new one may be. There were some rumors spreading in the community that it was going to be a $200 IM meant to punch well above competitors in its price range. Months later, even more hype was built as some were able to try the early prototypes, and those who did try it praised it quite heavily. There was a lot of hype in full swing, although over time, some images did start to emerge of a red IM that looked eerily similar to the Truthear Zero. Now, the Truthear Zero is another IM that Crinacle also worked on, and it's also the one IM from Truthear that I don't particularly like. When I first tried the Truthear Zero and then wrote one of my written reviews, I wasn't quite a fan of it. It was shouty, harsh, and not the most comfortable IM for me to wear. So it's safe to say that for myself, much of the hype slowed down when I saw these images, but I was still curious to try it, especially since I'd still heard so much praise about it. Well, a few months later, I received mine in the mail, and by this time, my excitement had built again just from the prospect of trying a new product. I unboxed it, selected the wideboard tips, and I felt disappointed. Much of the sound signature was actually quite decent. I liked the way that the bass was tuned, and the upper mids were much better than the original Zero. But the treble just felt lacking, like there was a large portion hidden away. At the time I was thinking, it's not really that much different than a Truthear Ola, just with a little bit less mid bass. Feeling a little disappointed from the hype, I decided to just measure them, and to be thorough, I also measured them with the narrowbore tips that were included with the IM, and I noticed something interesting. The measurements generated when the narrowbore tips were used seemed to have a different treble response than the widebore tips. In fact, it looked quite a bit better. So I decided to listen to them with the narrowbore tips, and it fixed the issues I was disappointed with. There was more treble, and it balanced out the IM, so it sounded good to me. So from here on out then, I'll be talking about the Truthear and Crinacle Zero Red in the context of using the narrowbore tips. I haven't stopped using this IM since I got it, in part because I want to be really thorough with this review, but also because it's just a good sounding IM that does nothing offensive. To me, the standout feature of this IM is the bass presentation. It feels mostly sub-bass focused and feels a bit more defined than many other IMs I've used. I'd go as far to say that I like the bass on this maybe even more than the Dusk. The bass doesn't really make itself too well known until it's really needed, giving things like bass drums a lot more of a defined hit. Along with that, the IM comes with a 10 ohm impedance adapter to increase the bass slightly. Now, the reason that this works to such a controlled degree is because of the two driver configuration. The subwoofer driver probably has a higher impedance than the full range driver, so when you add the 10 ohm adapter to the cable, it lowers the output volume of the full range driver slightly more than the subwoofer driver, making the subwoofer driver sound louder by comparison. This also scales as well with higher impedance adapters if you so desire. With the impedance adapter, the sub bass does feel a little bit less defined when it hits, but it does bring out things like bass guitars more, which I don't mind when listening to some older rock. For the rest of the response, it's pretty standard, aiming for a neutral sound signature, and I think it hits the mark quite well. I don't hear any of the harshness that some other budget IMs seem to have, and the treble is elevated enough where it doesn't sound dark or undetailed. Overall, it just sounds good without overdoing any part of the response. I think that's why I want to keep listening to it for so long. I do think this is an area where something like the Hexa does come across a little bit more detailed, but I think the Zero is a safer blind buy if you're concerned about too much treble from an IEM. I think the biggest issue with the Zero Red is more in its build and association with the old Zero. Other than having a good selection of tips, the accessories like the cable aren't really the best. The cable is fine, but I did have to untangle it every time I took it out of the carrying case. And as for the shell, I do like the red design more than the blue, but the shell is still bulky and also has a rather large nozzle. Normally I can get away with medium tips, but for the Zero Red I needed to use the smallest tips to fit my ears comfortably. I also do feel that this IM is sort of held back by its association with the original Zero. When this IM was released, there was a bit of a vocal upsetness from people about it being too cheap, and some calling it just a retuned Zero. I think that sort of mentality could affect people's perception of the product and cause them to look for even more flaws in order to validate it as just a budget product. But I honestly think that from the way that the Red sounds, if it had a different shell, a different cable, and was a bit more of a standalone product, people would probably praise it as good value if it was sold at $200.